What is the United States to you? For some, it is a land of freedom, where everyone can realize their dreams. For others, it is a global superpower that shapes policy and threatens the whole world. Or maybe you see America as the home of Hollywood, jazz, technology, and breakthrough ideas. But the history of the United States of America is not just about greatness and achievement. They once began as a small group of disparate colonies on the edge of the New World, surrounded by uncertainty and threat. It was a country of farmers, traders, and settlers who fought for independence and freedom but faced countless challenges. Nearly 250 years have passed since then. Today, the United States is the world's largest economy, political leader, and cultural center, influencing all aspects of global life. It is a country that has given the world innovations such as the internet and spaceflight, yet continues to face challenges, both of change and of international markets. How has America traveled this path? From the first European settlers and the struggle for independence to the global leadership of the 21st century, this video will reveal the amazing history of the United States, its ups and downs, triumphs and tragedies. The history of the United States is a story of struggle, ambition, and the pursuit of freedom. Let's walk through its key stages together and learn how a country that started in kindergarten changed the world. Before the arrival of Europeans, North America was home to hundreds of different peoples who developed unique cultures, languages, and traditions. These peoples inhabited a vast continent, the dense forests of the East Coast, the arid deserts of the Southwest, the vast conditions and cold expanses of Alaska. They adapted to a variety of conditions and created a society whose organization and way of life quickly intertwined with modern conditions. The forested regions of the eastern continent, such as the Appalachians and Great Lakes, were home to the Iroquois, Algonquins, and Cherokees. These peoples lived sedentary lives, built villages protected by vision walls, and practiced agriculture. Their staple crops, corn, beans, and pumpkins, called the Three Sisters, accompanied them with food and kept the land fertile. Farming was complemented by hunting and fishing, leading to tribal prosperity. The Iroquois, for example, have created a powerful political confederation consisting of several tribes. Their system of governance, based on consensus principles, creates a defense against external threats. This example of a standard social structure shows the high level of organization parameters of the region. In the Great Limits, where the vast steppes stretched out, the climate and landscape dictated a very different way of life. It was home to tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, whose culture was formed around bison. These animals were essential to them for food, clothing materials, teepees, traditional tents, and tools. Bison were also central to the spiritual life of peoples, and hunting them was accompanied by such rituals. The nomadic lifestyle required lightweight and mobile dwellings. Types made of bison skins and wooden frames could be easily disassembled and transported to a new location. The advent of horses, brought to North America by the Spanish, was a watershed moment. Horses not only increased mobility, but also greatly increased the efficiency of hunting. In addition to hunting, the peoples of the Great Plains Indians were gatherers, harvesting wild berries, roots, and herbs. These resources served both as food preparation and as a device for medicines. Life in relation to the conditions was difficult and required the preservation of knowledge in the natural environment that had been passed down from generation to generation. The southwest of the continent had an arid climate and special conditions for survival. Peoples such as the Pueblo, Hopi, and Navajo lived here. They built their homes out of clay and stone, unique apartment buildings as beautiful as a pueblo. These homes were not only durable, but also well protected from the extreme weather conditions common to the region. One of the main problems was the lack of water. To solve this problem, the peoples of the Southwest developed complex irrigation systems that rotated the collection and redistributed water to irrigate the fields. The major crops here were corn, beans, and pumpkins. Farming was supplemented by gathering as well as raising animals such as turkeys. The spiritual life of these peoples was strongly connected with numerous cycles, rituals related to farming, rules of rain dances, prayers to the spirits of earth and sky. These rituals not only strengthened the connection with nature, but also united the community. The culture of the southwestern peoples has been preserved in architecture, ceramics, and traditional festivals that have survived to this day. On the Pacific coast, natural resources were so abundant that local tribes were characterized by unique crafts and arts. The Haida, Tlingit, Chinook, and other peoples whose lives were closely tied to the ocean and rivers lived here. Fishing, especially the seasonal salmon fishery, was their economy. Surplus fish stocks supported permanent settlements and developed trade. These peoples were famous for their totem poles, which were symbols of their culture. Totems carved from giant trees reflect mythological stories, family histories, and clan statuses. They not only decorated the village, but also served as an important part of rituals and social life. In addition to totems, Pacific Coast tribes have huge canoes capable of carrying large loads over long distances. These boats, carved from solid tree trunks, were important for fishing, traveling, and trading. Items such as elaborate masks and wood carvings suggest a rich mythology and deep connection to the environment. The social structure and way of life of all members of the peoples of North America were intimately connected to nature. They found the land to be more than just a source of resources, a sacred space needed to sustain and protect. Myths, legends, and rituals reflect this philosophy, supporting the interconnectedness of humans with nature. The Iroquois, for example, viewed the earth as the mother that gave life, the sun as the father that ensured its growth. In the regions of the Great Plains Indians, bison represented not only food, but also a connection to ancestral spirits. In the vicinity of the Pacific Ocean, strong coastal waters and forests were symbols of abundance and the divine. These worldviews not only shaped daily life, but also supported the sustainability of society. Many rituals were aimed at maintaining a balance in nature, which promoted greater harmony with nature, which significantly influenced their lifestyles, economic activities, and traditions. Each region of the continent dictated its own rules of survival, and the peoples masterfully adapted to these conditions, using natural resources wisely and respectfully. In the east, in the forested areas, the indigenous people practiced farming, hunting, and fishing. Farming was their economy. The staple crops, corn, beans, and pumpkins, such as the Three Sisters, were grown together. The corn provided support for the curly beans, while the broad leaves of the gourd protected the soil from drying out and weeds. This method of farming was not only efficient, but also environmentally sustainable. In addition to agriculture, forest peoples hunted deer, bears, hares, and birds, and gathered nuts, berries, and medicinal herbs. Fishing parallels access to external sources of protein. For the Indians of the Great Plains, deprived of fertile lands, hunting and gathering became the basis. The main resource for them was bison, which they used to their full potential. Meat was used for food. Hides were turned into clothes and blankets for types. Bones became the result of labor, and ropes were made from dwellings. This approach leaves no waste and allows for the efficient use of resources. Bison hunting was not only labor-intensive, but also a spiritual process, accompanied by rituals that expressed respect for animals and nature. In the arid Southwest, economic activity centered around irrigation. Peoples, such as the Pueblo and Hopi, built complex systems of canals that modified irrigated fields to maintain water. They grew corn, beans, pumpkins, and chili peppers, and raised turkeys. Special granaries were used to store food, protecting the crops from the hot climate and pests of our time. The dwellings of these peoples also demonstrated their adaptation to special conditions. Pueblo-style houses of clay and stone were built to keep cool in summer and warm in winter. These apartment buildings, often built on cliff slopes, were not only dwellings, but also centers of social and ritual life. The Pacific Coast provided an abundance of outside resources that embraced tribesmen such as the Haida and Tlingit, who create a sophisticated craft. Fishing, especially salmon fishing, was central to their economy. They used canoes carved from giant tree trunks to fish, trade, and travel along the coast. In addition, the forests are used to build houses and create totem poles that symbolize the mythology and support the structure of these peoples. Craft played its major role in life, defining peoples and reflecting their practical needs as well as their aesthetic sensibility. The tribes of the Great Plains had an art of weaving and embroidering jewelry, clothing, and accessories, making items that are used both in daily life and in rituals. Eastern tribes, such as the Iroquois, were famous for creating elegant baskets from reeds and tree bark. In the Southwest, pottery was particularly notable. The Pueblo and Hopi peoples made vessels decorated with geometric patterns that were used for food storage and preparation, as well as in rituals. These pieces were characterized by craftsmanship and exquisite workmanship, making them objects of art, prized even in modern times. Pacific Coast people made intricately carved woodwork, including masks and sculptures that played a major role in ceremonies and rituals. Their totem poles were not just decorative objects, but important historical artifacts conveying legends, myths, and clan lineages. The economic activities, crafts, and traditions that characterize the peoples of North America were strongly influenced by their belief in harmony with nature. They saw the world around them as more than just resources for survival and endeavored to live in balance with the ecosystem that made up their lives. Spiritual life included features that were inseparable from their economic activities. Each action involving the use of resources had its own ritual or symbolic meaning. For example, before planting the Three Sisters, it was necessary to express gratitude to the earth. Hunting was accompanied by rituals, expressing respect for the animals that were sacrificed for people's sustenance. Rituals also played a key role in regulating the economic life of communities. Rain dances in the Southwest symbolized requests for fertility and harvests. And then, as a consequence of the conditions bison migrated through, strengthened the collective spirit of hunters. These traditions unite communities, provide knowledge, and maintain harmony with nature. The lives of the peoples of North America have been extremely diverse, but they are all united by a philosophy of respect for nature. Every resource is used as efficiently as possible, without waste. This approach to life, based on respect for the land and its gifts, has driven them to live and thrive for millennia, on creating a legacy that still inspires observers and conservationists today. Long before Europeans arrived in North America, complex and highly advanced civilizations flourished. They produced outstanding architectural, social, and technological achievements, many of which are still studied and admired today. Although major civilizations such as the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas surround the southern civilizations of the United States, their influence was felt throughout North America as well. In the southwest of the continent, the Anasazi, predecessors of the modern Pueblo, played a special role. These peoples built huge apartment buildings of clay and stone that sprawled on the slopes of canyons. One of the most famous examples is the Pueblo Bonito, a massive structure that included the cost of rooms. This building not only served as housing, but was also centers of social and ritual life. The Anasazi also developed sophisticated irrigation systems to efficiently utilize limited water resources for farming. They grew corn, beans, and pumpkins, which were foodstuffs. Archaeological evidence suggests that they had trade ties spanning vast territories and including the exchange of objects such as turquoise and rosettes. The Mississippian culture developed in the Great Plains and eastern North America. They left after experiencing the impressive heritage in the form of huge earthen mounds that were used as temples, burial grounds, and community centers. One of the largest and most famous archaeological sites is Cahokia, located in present-day Illinois. This city, whose population reached the level of 1,000 people, is a complex society with a clear social structure. Mississippians developed a farming system based on the cultivation of maize, which became the region's most important crop. Their trade networks covered great distances and developed subjects such as medicine, stone lamps, and exotic materials. They also practiced crafts, making ceramics with exquisite ornaments and metalwork, developing their artistic taste and technical skills. Mississippian culture reached its height in the 12th to 13th centuries, but by the time Europeans arrived, its influence had already waned considerably. Nevertheless, their legacy remains an important trace in the history of the region. The Hopewell culture existed in the northeast of the continent and left behind outstanding monuments in the form of simple earthworks, including mounds and geometric figures. These mounds are often used for ritual burials and as a site for important ceremonies. Archaeological discoveries made in the regions lead to a highly developed culture with an expanding network of these trade links. The Hopewell people create exquisite items of copper, obsidian, kitchen tables, and other materials that are placed in remote regions. Their art represents jewelry, stone carvings, and ceramic vessels, and distinctive building designs. The religious and astronomical aspects of their culture were also evident in the structures believed to have been used to observe the stars and seasonal changes. The Hopewellian social organization was based on small communities that came together for large community projects. The achievements of this culture reached the high level of development of the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America. Their architectural structures, irrigation systems, complex social structure, and craft traditions are evidence of easy ingenuity. Although major civilizations such as the Maya or Aztecs bounded the southern modern borders of the United States, their achievements influenced the northern territories as well. Stoneworking techniques, the establishment of water systems, and the principles of agriculture spread through trade and the frontier. These contacts facilitated the exchange of recommendations that were adapted to local conditions. What made each of these people unique was their ability to find a balance with nature, as well as their ability to create sustainable cultural communities. The Mississippian mounds, Anasazi irrigation forms, and wood carvings of the Pacific Coast peoples look like a natural resource that can be transformed into cultural heritage. These recent achievements are not only part of the past, but also serve as inspiration for the world today. They remind us that respect for the land and harmony with nature are fundamental principles for creating thriving communities. The Age of Discovery began with the dream of a direct western route to Asia. In the 15th century, trade in spices, silk, and other valuable goods from the East played an important role in the economy. However, the traditional routes through the Middle East became increasingly dangerous due to war and Ottoman control. This prompted European powers to seek new routes, and one of the pioneers of this era was Christopher Columbus. Spanish navigator from Colombia, inspired by the maps of his time, suggested that by sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean, it would be possible to reach the shores of Asia. After many countries found funding, he received the support of the Spanish crown. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand led the funded expedition, seeing it as a chance to strengthen Spanish influence and find riches. On August 3, 1492, the three ships, Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina, left the port of Palos. The journey was long and full of danger. The crew suffered from lack of food, fatigue, and fear of the unknown. Despite the difficulties, October 12, 1492 ships reached land, which Colombia named El Salvador. Columbus and his crew continued to explore the Caribbean region, including Cuba and Haiti. These lands impressed them with their high wealth and friendly populations. Columbus was confident that he had reached the fringes of Asia and enthusiastically returned to Spain with tales of discovery. In 1493, Columbus made a second voyage, this time with a much larger fleet and number of men. He returned to Hispaniola, establishing the first permanent European settlement in the Americas, La Navidad. However, the colonists faced enormous difficulties in their new location. Lack of resources, conflicts with indigenous peoples, and internal struggles undermined their efforts. Columbus made two more voyages, exploring the Caribbean Sea and the coast of Central America. But as it became clear that he had not reached Asia, the beginnings of his influence began to fade. Despite this, his discovery paved the way for further expeditions and cemented Spain's status as royal maritime powers. At the same time, Columbus's expeditions marked the beginning of a new era, the Age of Colonization. It was a point of reference involving cultural change, economic opportunity, and conquest that changed both the New World and Europe forever. Columbus's voyages began a massive interaction between two previously isolated worlds. This interaction, known as the Columbian Exchange, often exchanged food, animals, technology, and harm, but also had devastating consequences for the indigenous populations of the Americas. Europeans brought grain crops such as wheat and barley to the New World, as well as sugarcane, which became one of the traditional plantation crops. Domestic animals, horses, pigs, cows, and chickens, dramatically changed life according to the parameters. For example, horses introduced by the Spanish became a key element in the culture of the Great Plains Indians, increasing the tribe's mobility and their ability to hunt bison. From the Americas came products that revolutionized European agriculture and cuisine. Potatoes, corn, tomatoes, and cacao spread rapidly around the world, changing diets and stimulating economic growth. Potatoes, for example, became a staple food in Ireland and elsewhere, and became the basis for the chocolate demonstration. However, the exchange between Europe and America is not only about useful news. With the spread of ships to the new continent, the income from diseases, smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases, to which the constituent regions were not immune, caused epidemics that wiped out millions of people. Demographic collapse reached 90% in some regions, weakening resistance to colonization and destroying many indigenous cultures. Another aspect of the interaction was cultural conflict. Europeans, based on their notions of civilization, often perceived indigenous peoples as primitive and used this to justify their conquests. The colonizers introduced their religion, laws, and social orders, and the financial structure of the social fabric. Many indigenous peoples tried to adapt to the new conditions by establishing trade relations and adopting European technology. However, this rarely saved them from losing their land and cultural heritage. One of the earliest examples of such conflict was the resistance of the Taino Na tribe, which was a test of Spanish rule but was almost completely wiped out. In addition, the European understanding of land ownership becomes a cause of constant conflict. To consider matters, land was collective and sacred, while Europeans sought to turn it into private property. This fundamental study in worldview spurred conflicts that continue with difficulties. The first clash between the old and new worlds was the beginning of a cultural exchange that was as destructive as it was destructive. They changed the balance of power on the continents, laying the foundations for globalization, but they also brought millions to suffer. The discovery of America was followed by a massive European expansion that changed the geography and history of the entire world. Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands engaged in a bitter New World land deal, seeking to capitalize on their natural resources and establish control over new territories. Spain, a pioneer of exploration, dominated Central and South America. The conquests of Hernán Cortés, Mexico, and Francisco Pizarro, Peru, gave the Spanish access to gold and silver reserves. This flow of precious metals enriched the Spanish crown and increased its economic and political influence. However, these conquests were disastrous for the definition of peoples. The destruction of the Aztec and Inca empires, epidemics, forced Christianization, and mass enslavement. France focused its efforts on developing the northern and central territories. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain visited Quebec, which became the center of French colonization. The French explored the St. Lawrence River Basin, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley. They established commercial posts and established close relations with the indigenous peoples, which distinguished their approach from the Spanish. The fur trade became the French economy in the New World, mutually beneficial alliances with Indian tribes, avoiding serious consequences. England began its colonial projects later than Spain and France, but their efforts in North America were the most successful in major politics. In 1607, an English settlement arrived at the base of the Jamestown colony in Virginia, which was the first. The colony faced serious hardships, food shortages, epidemics, and conflicts with the population. However, thanks to the cultivation of tobacco, which became an export product, Jamestown survived and became a model for further English development. Unlike Spain and France, England often placed colonization in the hands of global companies such as the London and Plymouth companies. The colonies therefore increased autonomy and self-sufficiency. By the mid-17th century, 13 British colonies had been founded. Southern colonies such as Virginia, North and South Carolina focused on plantation farms. Tobacco and cotton became alternative export crops that required large amounts of labor. By the end of the 17th century, a system of slavery had spread, using African slaves brought across the Atlantic Ocean. The middle colonies, such as New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, developed as centers of commerce and agriculture. A diverse population, including immigrants from the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden, prevailed here. The northern colonies, including Massachusetts and Rhode Island, were based largely on religious conventions, such as the Puritans and Quakers. They built their societies around strict democratic constraints that shaped production and the political atmosphere. European expansion in the New World entailed sweeping changes in the global economy and culture. The emergence of new products and resources, such as potatoes, corn, sugarcane, and tobacco, stimulated trade and agriculture in the Old World. At the same time, the use of African slave labor in the plantation economy laid the foundation for the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery became part of the economy of the southern colonies. African slaves brought to the Americas were forced to work on plantations under inhumane conditions. This led to the formation of a society in which slavery became a social hierarchy. The economic dependence on slavery caused deep contradictions that later led to conflicts and upheavals. The Netherlands, for example, formed the colony of New Amsterdam, future New York, in 1624, which soon became one of the largest trading centers in the region. However, in 1664, the colony was captured by the English, who strengthened their position in North America. By the 18th century, European expansion had reached its peak. Control over territories, resources, and political influence became an indicator of the power of states, leading to growing tensions and problems. These processes set the stage for major historical events, such as the struggle for independence and the creation of new states. At the beginning of the 17th century, England began to actively develop the territories of North America. The main purpose of colonization was benefits, the development of new lands, and the search for religious freedom. The first English settlements faced difficulties, but their reliance was a key milestone in the future in the United States. The first permanent English settlement, Jamestown, was established in 1607 in Virginia. The expedition was financed by a London company that saw the New World as a source of wealth. However, the reality turned out to be harsh. The first winter lived the life of most of the colonists because of hunger, disease, and contact with the Powhatan tribes. But through the efforts of John Smith, who established relations with the Indians and introduced tobacco smoking as an export crop, Jamestown survived and became the prototype for an economically profitable settlement. In 1620, a group of dissidents known as the Pilgrims formed the Plymouth colony in what is now Massachusetts. They were looking for the religious freedom they could not find in England. On the ship Mayflower, they crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed on the northeast coast. Before landing, the colonists signed the Mayflower Compact, the first document establishing constitutional justice. The Plymouth colony faced a harsh winter that killed most of the settlers. However, an alliance with the Wampanoag tribe was crucial to their survival. Native-trained colonists used farming techniques, growing corn, beans, and pumpkins. This union marked the celebration of the first Thanksgiving, an event that came to symbolize unity and mutual aid. After the success of Plymouth, other colonies on the East Coast began to develop rapidly. Massachusetts Bay became a center of Puritan religious culture. In the 1630s, thousands of Puritans moved into the region, seeking to create a society based on strict moral principles and equality before God. However, their religious strictness and intransigence toward dissent led to the emergence of new colonies such as Rhode Island. Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams, who favored religious liberty and separation of church and state. This settlement became a concern for those who found no place in Puritan society. Another important colony, Connecticut, led the settlers' quest to find fertile land for farming. Southern colonies such as Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas developed along a similar path. Maryland, founded in 1632 by Lord Baltimore, became a register for Catholics persecuted in England. Over time, however, Protestants embraced the entire population, leading to conflicts and restrictions on absolute freedom. Large plantation farms began to form in Virginia and the Carolinas. The region's economy was based on the cultivation of tobacco, rice, and indigo, which were exported to Europe. This culture required a large amount of labor, and at first the colonists used contracted wage laborers. By the end of the 17th century, however, a system of slavery had developed in the southern colonies that led to dictates and economic changes. By the 1650s, the English colonies had already formed a chain of settlements along the eastern seaboard. Each region developed in its own way, but they all had one thing in common: a desire for self-government and a search for economic opportunity. These colonies became experimental sites where the foundations of a future American identity were formed. The colonization of North America inevitably led to consequences between the customary settlers and the indigenous peoples living in the lands. These conflicts were caused by competition over resources, territories, and cultural differences. Europeans, who saw America as an opportunity to expand their ownership, viewed land as private property, while to be included was a sacred space respected by all. In the early years of colonization, relations between indigenous peoples and Europeans were mixed. Many native tribes led to the new settlers, doing business on the basis of farming principles and local territories. For example, the alliance of the Wampanoag tribe and the Pilgrims helped the Plymouth colony survive the first difficult years. As European settlements expanded, however, conflicts arose. Jamestown, founded in 1607, saw its first serious occurrences with the Powhatan tribe. In 1622, Chief Opachancino built a major defense on the settlement, resulting in the deaths of 1/3 of its inhabitants. The English responded with harsh military action that wiped out many of the villagers. This conflict came to symbolize the increasing tension between the two buildings. In the north, one of the most devastating clashes was the Pequot War in 1636 to 1638. English colonists, exposed to allied tribes such as the Narragansetts, decimated the Pequots, effectively eliminating them as an independent people. This was the first step toward a massive army buildup aimed at the native peoples of New England. King Philip's War, which broke out in 1675, was another important milestone in the confrontation. Metacom, whom the English called King Philip, wanted to stop the expansion of the colonists. The conflict was devastating for the sides. Hundreds of settlements were burned and thousands of Europeans were killed. In 1676, Metacom was killed and his allies were defeated. The war ended with the actual destruction of independence, leading the New England tribes. In the Southwest, the conflict situation was different. Spanish missionaries and the military tried to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and integrate them into the colonial system. These efforts were often accompanied by income generation and the destruction of traditional ways of life. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was one of the most prominent examples of the theory. The indigenous people temporarily drove the Spanish out of the region, destroying the mission and rebuilding their traditions. Although the Spanish returned several years later, this rebellion demonstrated the possibility of incorporating elements to resistance. Conflict in the expansion of the British colonies in the 18th century shifted westward to the Ohio River Valley and the Great Restraints. Indigenous peoples, such as the Shawnee, Delaware, and Iroquois, resisted expansion in defense of their land. The Pontiac Rebellion of 1763 came to symbolize this resistance. Although the British supported the rebellion, they forced the adoption of the 1763 Proclamation, which restricted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Another disastrous aspect of colonization was the epidemic caused by the effects of disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza wiped out millions of residents, often devastating entire villages. These epidemics created popular opportunities that effectively facilitated colonization and destroyed their social structure. Demographic collapse in the regions reached 90%, one of the most tragic aspects of some eras of colonization. By the end of the 18th century, most of the major restrictions had been suppressed. Their territories were increasingly shrinking, and the Near People's way of life was being disrupted by the onslaught of the principle of culture and economic activity. Nevertheless, resistance did not disappear. Indigenous peoples continued to fight for their identity and land despite brutal repression and unequal conditions. The conflicts between the indigenous peoples and the colonizers were a symbolic accident of two worlds. It was not just a struggle over walls, but a clash of two very different views of life, nature, and society. These events have remained an unexplored footprint in North American history and continue to remind us of the complexity and tragedy of the colonization period. By the 18th century, the 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America had formed a unique society based on the traditions of the European Union and the new realist New World. Colonists seek to create thriving communities that promote economic stability, personal freedom, and religious independence. Each region of the colonies developed differently. In New England, life centered around community and private values. The Puritans built their settlements with the goal of creating a city on a hill, a society based on strict moral principles. Their culture was based on hard work, education, and self-reliance. It was here that the first schools and colleges began to form, such as Harvard, founded in 1636. The middle colonies, such as New York and Pennsylvania, were characterized by ethnic and religious differences. English, Dutch, German, Irish, and Scottish people live here. These colonies prospered through trade and farming. Pennsylvania, founded by Quaker William Penn, became a model of tolerance and democracy, attracting settlers from across Europe. The southern colonies, including Virginia and the Carolinas, became economically dependent on plantation agriculture. Tobacco, rice, and indigo are grown here and exported to Europe. Plantations required slaves to devote large amounts of labor, which led to mass consumption. This system contributed to the significant social and social status, made the South a stronghold of the slave economy. Culture and daily life in the colonies underwent significant changes. Analyzing Enlightenment ideas that penetrated from Europe stimulated interest in science, philosophy, and a small number of people. Magazines, newspapers, and books, such as the works of John Locke, inspired colonists to rethink the role of government and individual liberty. Economic development also contributed to the new strict order. The colonies grew in number of artisans, merchants, and farmers who sought independence and enforced their regulations. At the same time, the system of colonial trade, based on shipments to England and the purchase of finished goods, caused discontent among the colonists. By the mid-18th century, colonists' discontent with English policies began to grow. Laws imposed by the British Crown restricted their commercial freedom and increased taxes. Ideas about the need for self-government and independence from the metropolis began to grow. The colonies began to realize their strength and identity. Their path to independence became increasingly clear. The internal strife that had accumulated over the years, in cooperation with Britain, eventually led to a key event in North American history, the War of Independence. By the mid-18th century, the British colonies in North America faced severe economic and political constraints from the metropolis. Although the colonists had enjoyed the same level of autonomy for more than a century, increasing pressure from Britain caused unrest and discontent. These events gradually set the stage for one of the most significant events in history, the War of Independence. One of the main causes of tension was taxation. After the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain was in a difficult financial situation. Parliament decided to offset the costs on the American colonies despite the fact that they had already made a significant contribution to the war. In 1764, the Sugar Act was passed, restricting trade and increasing fees, and in 1765, the Stamp Duty Act was passed, requiring colonists to pay taxes on official documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. These laws caused a storm of resentment among the colonists, who saw them as undermining their economic freedom. The colonists held common measures violated their rights as British subjects because taxes were imposed without their agreement. The slogan, "Net taxes without representation," became a symbol of their protest, leading to a demand to include representatives of the colonies in the British Parliament. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 made the situation even worse. This decree prohibited colonists from settling land west of the watershed running along the Appalachian Mountains, which caused resentment among farmers, merchants, and landowners seeking to expand their holdings. Many of them saw these lands as an opportunity for economic growth, and British restrictions were perceived as a betrayal of their interests. Amid growing discontent, the Boston Massacre occurred in 1770. During protests against the presence of British soldiers in the colonies, conflict erupted and several colonists were killed. This event was one of the first examples of open warfare between British authorities and Americans, which heightened tensions and rallied the colonists against the metropoles. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies. In response, colonists staged the Boston Tea Party, a protest in which activists dressed as Indians threw a load of tea worth thousands of pounds into the water. This event came to symbolize defiance of the British authorities. In response to the protest, the British Parliament introduced the so-called Intolerable Acts, 1774, which limited Massachusetts' autonomy, closed the port of Boston, and increased control over the colonies. These measures to suppress resistance only increased antagonism between the metropoles and the colonies. In 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress. They sent a petition to King George III calling for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts and the restoration of their rights, but the king rejected the demands. This was a turning point. The idea of independence began to rally the people, and the colonies began to prepare for possible armed conflict. By early 1775, tensions had reached a critical point. The colonists began to form militias, stockpile weapons, and prepare for war. Their discontent was no longer limited to economic demands. It became a struggle for freedom and equality. The premise of the conflict laid the groundwork for a revolution that would soon change not only North America, but the world. By 1775, the contradictions between the colonies and Great Britain had reached a breaking point. Attempts by the Crown to impose new taxes, restrict free trade, and interfere in the administration of the colonies only led to more and more resistance. The colonists, inspired by Enlightenment ideas, began to realize their political and economic power. The accumulated tension led to the first armed conflict. In the spring of 1775, British commanders moved troops into Massachusetts to confiscate munitions and collect weapons from militia officers. This led to a clash at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. The British were subjected to the arrest of leaders and the destruction of armories. At Lexington, British soldiers encountered a small militia unit. It is not known who fired first, but these shots heard around the world started the war. After the incident at Lexington, British troops moved on to Concord. Here they met more organized resistance. The colonists used guerrilla warfare tactics. They ambushed, struck, and quickly withdrew. The British troops suffered heavy casualties on their way back to Boston. These events represent that the colonists are willing to defend their rights. Immediately after the initial clashes, militia mobilization began throughout New England. Initiative Party colonists, known as Minutemen, are ready to join the fight at any moment. Soon, the Second Continental Congress, meeting in May 1775, announced the creation of the Continental Army. Washington, who had experience in the French and Indian War, was appointed commander-in-chief in Georgia, making him the best candidate. In the summer of 1775, American and British forces clashed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although the British were able to capture the colonists' positions, this victory came at a high price. Casualties among the British troops were notable. For the colonists, it was proof that they could hold off the British regular army. While besieging Boston, the Americans gradually strengthened their position. In early 1776, the colonists captured artillery from Fort Ticonderoga and used it to fortify positions around the city. Under threat, British troops left Boston in March 1776, marking the first notable victory for the colonists. Despite the successes, the situation for the colonists remained difficult. Great Britain had one of the strongest armies and navies in the world, while America suffered from a lack of resources, discipline, and professional soldiers. However, the colonists' desire to defend their rights and freedom continued to grow. More and more people were inclined to believe that a complete break with Great Britain was the only way to secure independence and protect their interests. By early 1776, and the Deed of Independence had gained support among the colonists. Although many initially sought to restore equitable relations with Great Britain, the growing repressive policies of the metropolis made this impossible. The literature and journalism of the time, especially Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, played a key role in public opinion. Common Sense, published in January 1776, became the best-selling book of its time. Paine explained in an accessible and compelling way why monarchy was unjust and disempowering, and why independence was a defense of the right of every nation. His ideas inspired the colonists and strengthened their resolve to fight for freedom. In June 1776, the Second Continental Congress formed a committee to draft a declaration calling for independence of the colonies from Great Britain. The main author of the document was Thomas Jefferson, a talented writer and philosopher. He laid down the principles that launched the American Revolution: the equality of all people, the controlling rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the right to overthrow a tyrannical government. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was officially adopted. That day was a turning point in the history of not only the United States, but the entire world. The document not only declared the independence of the 13 colonies, but also became a symbol of the struggle for freedom and human rights. The adoption of the Declaration caused excitement among the colonists, but it also meant that the conflict with Great Britain had reached a point of no return. It was no longer just a struggle for rights, but a war to create a new nation. After the Declaration of Independence, the war entered a decisive phase. Britain mobilized its forces in an effort to crush the rebellion, while the colonists struggled for survival and freedom. In July 1776, the British launched a major offensive in New York City. Under the command of General William Howe, the British Army landed on Long Island, defeating poorly prepared American troops. George Washington was forced to retreat to keep his army together, but was able to organize a successful retreat across the Hudson River. New York remained under complete British control throughout the war. Despite early defeats, the colonists showed resilience. In the winter of 1776, Washington launched his famous advance across the Delaware River. This was the first maneuver in an offensive against the Hessian units of the British Army at Trenton on the morning of December 26th. Having secretly planned the operation, Washington led a Continental Army column across the ice-covered Delaware, a technically difficult and dangerous operation. With the strength of his column, Washington attacked Colonel Johannes Rall's detachment at Trenton, defeated it, and then retreated to Pennsylvania, taking with him many prisoners and captured ammunition. The key moment of the war was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. General Horatio Gates surrounded the British Army under John Burgoyne, forcing it to surrender. This victory was the decisive factor that prompted France to enter the war on the side of the colonists. French support changed the course of the war. The alliance with France provided the colonists with access to arms, ammunition, finance, and troops. The French Navy played a key role in securing facilities, especially in the siege of Yorktown. The war became international when Spain and the Netherlands joined in, further weakening the British position. By 1780, the main fighting was in the south. The British were counting on loyalist support but faced fierce resistance. The American army under Nathanael Greene waged a successful guerrilla war, depleting British forces. The decisive event of the war was the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. A combined force of American and French armies under Washington and Rochambeau surrounded General Cornwallis's British army. After several weeks of siege, the British capitulated. This victory effectively ended the hostilities. The surrender at Yorktown symbolized the victory of the American Revolution. More than 6 years into the war, it showed that a nation fighting for its freedom could defy even the strongest enemy. The conclusion of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 finalized the independence of the United States. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 was the turning point in the War of Independence. After this establishment, Great Britain lost hope of regaining control of the colonies. Although hostilities in some regions continued for another 2 years, the main events ended at the International Conference. In 1783, representatives of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Spain met in Paris to conclude a peace treaty. The Treaty of Paris officially recognized the independence of the United States of America and fixed the borders of the new country. The treaty extended U.S. territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes in the north to Florida in the south, which was returned to Spain. The peace agreement ended the era of British dominance in America. For the first time in history, the colony not only achieved independence, but set a precedent for a popular revolution based on the ideals of freedom, unity, and popular self-government. However, the road to independence proved to be only the beginning. The young republic faced many appeals. The need for a new system of government to unify the disparate states into a single nation. Questions about the role of the federal government, states' rights, international relations, and capacity development became major topics of discussion in the post-revolutionary period. After independence, the United States faced a difficult task: building a new political system that would allow the 13 states to unite while retaining their autonomy. The first steps in this direction were the Articles of Confederation, established in 1781. However, the Articles created a weak central government unable to effectively regulate commerce, collect taxes, or resolve interstate conflicts. This weakness became particularly evident during the Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, when farmers, dissatisfied with international taxes and economic hardship, rose up in armed rebellion. The central government proved incapable of handling this crisis, prompting the country's leaders to overhaul the system of governance. In 1787, a constitutional convention convened in Philadelphia, where state representatives drafted a new constitution. This document laid the foundation for the federal system of government, dividing power between the executive, legislative, and national branches. The Constitution also established a fundamental balance of power between the federal state and the states, which was a key factor in keeping the countries united. In 1789, the Constitution went into effect. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. His rule became a symbol of stability and national unity, which was important for the young republic. During this period, the foundations of the American economy, military, and diplomacy were laid, which allowed the country to strengthen its position on the international stage. The transition from revolution to republic tested the new nation. The United States faced challenges such as the means of national identity, resolving relations with indigenous peoples, and establishing foreign relations. However, the spirit of freedom and fidelity to democratic principles are helping the country to overcome these challenges and begin the journey towards leaving the one-world state. The 19th century was a period of tremendous growth for the United States. Since the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the conclusion of the War of Independence, the country has sought to develop new lands, expand its borders, and position itself as a leading force on the continent. Territorial expansion was not only a geographical, but also an ideological process driven by the concept of destiny within, manifest destiny. This idea asserted that the United States was destined to develop lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific, to spread democracy, freedom, and progress. The first major step toward expansion was the purchase of Louisiana from France in 1803. For $15 million, the U.S. doubled its borders by gaining control of the strategically important Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans. Covering more than 2 million square kilometers, these lands offer tremendous opportunities for agriculture and trade. Immediately following the transaction, an organized Lewis and Clark expedition began to explore the new territories. The expedition lasted from 1804 to 1806 and was an important milestone in the exploration of uncharted lands. Lewis and Clark created large-scale maps, studied flora and fauna, and made contact with indigenous peoples, many of whom helped the expedition survive. This project not only opened up new land to settlers, but also shaped perceptions of the vast possibilities of the Western territories. In the 1820s and 1830s, the United States continued to expand. In 1821, Florida officially became part of the country after a treaty with Spain. At the same time, the Texas territories belonging to Mexico were increasingly attracting American attention. American settlers who settled the region soon began negotiating for Texas independence. In 1836, after victory at the Alamo and victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, Texas declared independence, and in 1845 became part of the United States. The annexation of Texas provoked the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, which was the next phase of territorial expansion. After the United States won the war on Guadalupe Hidalgo's terms, the country gained a vast amount of territory, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of other modern states. These lands not only increase the country's territory, but also provide access to considerable wealth, including gold and agricultural resources. The California Gold Rush, which began in 1848, was the catalyst for further expansion. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill attracted hundreds of thousands of settlers from around the world, which spurred the development of the region. California quickly transformed from a little-known territory to a key state in the Union, officially joining in 1850. The gold rush stimulated the labor movement, including new roads, railroads, and ports. By the mid-19th century, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was a necessary step in the development of Western lands. Completed in 1869, it connected the eastern and western states, allowing for the rapid movement of people and goods. The railroad became a symbol of progress and national unity, integrating the new territories into the country's economic and political system. However, territorial expansion entailed serious conflicts with indigenous peoples. The constant encroachment of settlers on their lands disrupted the order of life and caused mass resistance. U.S. government policy toward these peoples became more stringent, especially after the passage of the Indian Removal Act 1830. This act legalized the authority to relocate peoples from their ancestral territories in the West. The most tragic result of this policy was the Road of Tears, the relocation of the Cherokee and other tribes from the southeastern states in the 1830s. Thousands of Indians begged for European residence along the way because of starvation, disease, and poor conditions. Despite resistance, indigenous peoples left their lands, resulting in the destruction of their culture and territories. The westward expansion also caused ecological changes. The development of new lands led to massive deforestation, bison extinction, and ecosystem changes. These changes, while boosting the economy, have had long-term effects on the environment. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was completing its continental boundaries. Territorial expansion brought vast resources, new opportunities, and enhanced the U.S.'s role as a rising power. However, the process had costs, including the destruction of cultural, environmental issues, and serious internal controversies, such as the issue of slavery in the new territories. The territorial expansion of the United States in the 19th century exacerbated the major domestic conflict of the time, the slavery controversy. While the northern states sought to limit it and gradually move toward free labor, the southern states defended the slave system that was the foundation of their economy. The South, with its plantation economy, depended on the labor of millions of African slaves to grow cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. These commodities were the mainstay of U.S. exports and generated huge profits for the Southern elite. The North, on the contrary, developed as an industrialized region with growing cities and a free labor market. Economic and cultural differences between North and South gradually transformed into ideological confrontation. The first attempts to limit the spread of slavery began as early as the late 18th century, but the issue became particularly acute in 1820 when Congress passed the Missouri Compromise. The act prohibited slavery in all new territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel except Missouri. The compromise temporarily relieved tensions, but did not resolve the core issue. From the mid-19th century, territorial conquests such as the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas, and the lands gained after the Mexican-American War presented the United States with a new challenge. What would be the status of slavery in these territories? Each new state or territory that became part of the Union became a battleground between supporters and opponents of slavery. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 was a watershed moment. The law allowed residents of the new territories to decide slavery on their own, which upset the balance established by the Missouri Compromise. This sparked an outbreak of violence known as Bloody Kansas, where supporters and opponents of slavery engaged in armed clashes as they fought for control of the territory. The abolitionist movement, which was active in the North, became a powerful force threatening the slave system. Leaders of the movement, such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, used publications, public speeches, and direct action to fight slavery. Harrison's newspaper, The Liberator, promoted the immediate emancipation of slaves, and former slave Frederick Douglass inspired millions with his autobiography and speeches calling for equality. The book Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, played a special role in shaping public opinion. This novel emotionally revealed the cruelty of slavery, causing a storm of indignation in the northern states and increasing the discontent of the Southerners. The book became a symbol of anti-slavery sentiment and had a tremendous impact on public opinion. In the South, slavery was considered not only an economic necessity, but also part of social and cultural identity. Southerners argued that the slave system was moral and even beneficent, claiming that it civilized slaves. Many Southern elites saw abolitionists as a threat to their way of life and prepared to defend their rights with arms. Political conflicts between the North and South became more and more intense. The formation of the Republican Party in 1854, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, was a challenge to the South. At the same time, each new compromise, whether the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850, only delayed the inevitable split. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was the last straw. Lincoln was opposed to the spread of slavery, although he did not initially favor its immediate abolition. The Southern states perceived his victory as a threat to their existence. Soon, the process of secession began. First South Carolina, and then 10 other states announced their secession from the Union, forming the Confederacy. By early 1861, the social divide had reached its climax. The North-South divide could no longer be resolved by compromise. Tensions that had been building up for decades turned into an armed confrontation that soon escalated into a civil war. The Civil War was not only a conflict in the history of the United States, but also shaped the future of the nation. The war covered the entire American continent. It destroyed more than 600,000 lives and left an indelible mark on the political, economic, and social development of the country. The conflict began on April 12, 1861, with Confederate resistance at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. This event began an open confrontation between the northern states, Union, and the southern states, which declared their independence and formed the Confederacy. The war erupted over the ongoing differences between the two regions. Although the main conflict was over slavery, there were other reasons behind it: states' rights, domestic differences, and political dominance. At the outset of hostilities, both sides expected to win. The North had numerical and industrial superiority, providing an advantage over the South. The concentration of most of the factories, weapons factories, and aid methods in the north of the Union states was a major advantage in the war. In addition, the North had access to a more developed banking system that allowed for quick mobilization of finances. The South, by contrast, relied on exports, relying on Britain and France, with whom the southern states had major economic relationships, to provide constitutional and military support for the Confederacy. However, this strategy did not pay off. The European countries chose a neutral position, preferring not to start a conflict with the Union. Nevertheless, the Confederate Army and talented commanders such as Robert E. Lee and Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson brought many quick victories to the South. Strategy and tactics played a key role in the early years of the war. Northern generals, such as George McClellan, demonstrated indecisiveness that forced Southern troops to maintain tactical victory despite their smaller numbers. The The First Battle of the Bull Run in July 1861 ended in Union defeat, causing shock among the northern population and making the authorities realize the serious significance of the war. This document proclaimed the freedom of all slaves in the Confederate States, which changed the nature of the war from a fight to preserve the Union to a support for freedom and equality. The issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 had far-reaching consequences. It strengthened support for the Union among abolitionists and freed thousands of slaves who became active in the war by joining the Union Army. By the end of the war, more than 180,000 African Americans served in its ranks, and through their actions not only strengthened the Army, but also demonstrated their contribution to achieving victory. 1863 was a turning point in the war. The Battle of Gettysburg took place in July and was the largest and one of the most important battles of the Civil War. General Robert E. Lee's army attempted to move the hostilities north, hoping to undermine Union morale. However, the reflection ended in a Confederate defeat, after which Lee was forced to retreat. This battle ended the advance northward and marked the beginning of a significant decline in the South. Union successes in the West. After a long siege, General Grant's troops captured Vicksburg, securing control of the Mississippi River. This victory tore the Confederacy in two, seriously undermining its ability to coordinate action. Grant introduced the crisis of total war, realizing that victory depended not only on destroying the army, but also on undermining its economy and will to resist. One of the key operations was General William Sherman's March to the Sea. In 1864, Sherman's army marched through Georgia, destroying Confederate infrastructure, farms, and supplies. This tactic caused serious damage in the South, hastening the end of the war. By early 1865, the Confederate position had become exceptional. The Southern economy was devastated, resources were depleted, and the army was severely weakened. Union forces launched an offensive on the Confederate capital of Richmond. In late 1865, General Robert E. Lee capitulated to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, which ultimately ended the Civil War. The Civil War had left deep wounds in the historical society. Nearby towns and farms in the South lay in ruins, and the region's economy was all but improved. Amid the devastation and loss, there was a need to re-examine the country and slow down the social and political divisions created by the war. The best outcome of the conflict was the eventual abolition of slavery. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, which legally banned slavery throughout the United States. The move marked a new period in the country's history, but it also presented many new challenges, including the integration of millions of freed slaves into society. President Lincoln, whose determination and leadership played a key role in the Union victory, did not live to see the end of the war. April 14, 1865 in Washington, D.C., at a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, Lincoln was fatally shot in the head with a pistol shot by a Southern supporter, actor John Wilkes Booth. This tragedy became a national tragedy that only intensified the divisions in approaches to Southern Reconstruction. Despite the victory, the Civil War left many unresolved issues. North and South continued to exist as two different worlds, separated not only by economic but also by cultural barriers. The struggle for equality and rights that began during the war became a long and complex process that would shape the development of the United States throughout the next stages. After the Civil War ended, the United States entered a period of Reconstruction that lasted from 1865 to 1877. This phase focused on rebuilding the country, reintegrating Southern states into the Union, and granting rights to freed slaves. However, Reconstruction proved to be a complex and controversial process that uncovered deep social and political divisions. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, officially banned slavery throughout the United States. This was the first step toward creating a new society where millions of freed slaves were given a chance at freedom. However, their integration into American life faced obstacles. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after his assassination, offered a soft approach to the South. He sought the rapid reintegration of former rebellious states without requiring significant changes in the rights of African Americans. This approach drew criticism from radical Republicans who were committed to social reform. In 1867, Congress took control of the Reconstruction process by enacting the Reconstruction Acts. The South was divided into 5 military districts where federal troops enforced the new laws. During this period, the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship to all born in the United States, and the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights to all men, regardless of race, were passed. Despite significant legislative changes, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance in the South. White elites, who had lost their former dominance, began an active struggle to regain control. Included were so-called black codes, laws that restricted the rights of African Americans, effectively making them dependent workers. Organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan used revenue and intimidation to stifle political activism among Black Americans and their allies. Attacks on voters, politicians, and teachers became a phenomenon that undermined efforts to create an equal society. Nevertheless, Reconstruction brought important changes. For the first time in history, African Americans began to participate actively in political life. They took seats in Southern state legislatures, and several were elected to Congress. Schools and universities were also established for freed slaves, a step toward overcoming illiteracy and integrating them into society. However, federal support for Reconstruction began to wane. By the late 1870s, northern states were becoming less and less interested in serving the South, and opponents of reform were growing stronger. The key was the agreement reached after the disputed election, 1876. Through Republican President Rutherford Hayes, federal troops were drawn from southern states. This marked the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the period known as the Provision Years. After the withdrawal of federal troops, southern states quickly re-established white supremacy. Jim Crow laws were passed, introducing a system of racial segregation and disenfranchising African Americans. These laws remained in place until their repeal in 1964, ensuring racial conformity. After the Civil War, the United States entered an era of rapid economic growth known as the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900. This period was a time of major change as the country transformed from an agrarian society to one of the world's leading industrialized powers. However, the glitter of successes masked social problems, corruption, and deep inequality. One of the driving forces behind the economic transformation was the construction of railroads. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869 became a symbol of national progress. The railroad network linked eastern and western states, accelerating trade, relocation, and integration of territories. These highways provided transportation for key commodities, coal, steel, agricultural products, and were a catalyst for the growth of other industries. The industrial boom was also driven by the introduction of new technologies and the discovery of natural resources. The development of industries such as steel, oil, and textiles made the United States a leader in industrialized manufacturing. Andrew Carnegie created the largest steel corporation by utilizing modern production methods and aggressive business strategies. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, which dominated the oil market, controlling nearly 90% of the country's refining. Cornelius Vanderbilt became a key figure in the railroad industry, connecting major trading hubs and cities. These tycoons, often referred to as robber barons, concentrated enormous wealth in their hands through monopolistic practices, manipulating markets, and suppressing competition. Their work was both admired and reviled. Many saw them as symbols of the American dream, while others saw them as perpetrators of social inequality. Urbanization was an important consequence of industrialization. Major cities such as New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia grew rapidly, becoming industrial and financial centers. By the end of the century, nearly 40% of the U.S. population lived in urban areas, signaling a significant demographic change. Millions of immigrants from Europe became the basis for the labor force in the factories and railroads. People came from Ireland, Italy, Germany, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia, hoping to find work and a better life. However, many of them faced poverty, poor working conditions, and discrimination. Immigrant neighborhoods such as Little Italy or the Lower East Side in New York City were characterized by overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and high crime rates. For the working class, the Gilded Age was a time of hardship. Workers in factories and mines labored 12 to 14 hours a day for low wages without any social protection. Frequent accidents, lack of safety standards, and poor living standards caused a wave of discontent. The response was the creation of labor unions and the growth of the labor movement. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, was founded. Unions fought for shorter hours, higher wages, and better working conditions. Strikes such as the Haymarket Demonstration of 1886 and the Railroad Strike 1877 became large-scale protests, but were often accompanied by violence and clashes with authorities. Political life in the Gilded Age was marked by corruption and the enormous influence of large corporations. Political machines, such as Tammany Hall in New York City, controlled elections, the appointment of officials, and the distribution of contracts, often using bribes and pressure. The big tycoons influenced Congress by blocking attempts to regulate their activities. However, along with corruption came the process of reform. Investigative journalists called make-trakers exposed scandals related to industrialists and politicians. Their publications drew attention to working class and poverty issues, which became the basis for a progressive movement aiming for change in the early 20th century. The late 19th century in the United States was a time of significant social change and energized social movements. These changes affected all walks of life and areas of society, from the struggle for women's and African American rights to reforms in labor, education, and conservation. One of the key themes of this period was the struggle for African American rights. After the end of Reconstruction, the South came under the sway of Jim Crow laws, which enshrined racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans politically and economically. Despite this, leaders in the black community, such as Booker T. Washington and William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, began to promote ideas of self-determination and the fight for equality. Washington called for gradual reforms, focusing on education and economic development. For his part, Du Bois insisted on an immediate political struggle for equal rights, arguing that full equality could not be achieved without civil liberties. These two viewpoints became the basis for the later strategy of the civil rights movement. The struggle for women's rights also reached new heights. Since mid-century, the women's movement has been actively demanding voting rights. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention was the first major gathering to raise the issue of gender equality. Leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony promoted the idea that women should be active participants in political life. By the end of the 19th century, the fight for women's rights centered on suffrage. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, founded in 1890, became the leading organization advocating for the right to vote. Women held rallies, marches, and agitations in an effort to draw attention to their struggles. Although suffrage had not yet been achieved at the national level, some western states, such as Wyoming and Colorado, were the first to grant women the right to vote. Social reforms extended to the labor sphere. Workers' movements became more organized, which led to a number of successes. Restrictions on child labor, shorter hours, and higher wages were the main demands of the unions. Special attention was paid to improving working conditions, especially after tragic incidents such as the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York in 1911. In addition, environmental consciousness began to emerge. Massive deforestation, river pollution, and resource depletion created a wave of concern. One of the first steps to protect nature was the creation of Yellowstone National Park in 1872, the first national park in the world. This step symbolized the beginning of the conservation movement in the United States. Significant changes were taking place on the cultural front. American literature, art, and music began to reflect a unique national identity. Writers such as Mark Twain described the lives of ordinary people while criticizing the social and political ills of the era. Art increasingly turned to themes of everyday life and national history. Social reforms provided the foundation for future changes. The struggle for women's rights, Labor rights and equality for African Americans continued into the next century, and the conservation movement intensified. This period demonstrated that American society was ready to change, adapting to new challenges and creating a more equitable system. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States was rapidly emerging as a leading world power. Following the end of the 19th century's internal conflicts and the Reconstruction period, the country focused on economic and technological development, giving it a unique opportunity to consolidate its influence both inside and outside the Americas. The economic growth of the United States was phenomenal. Industry, supported by high rates of urbanization and the introduction of new technologies, reached unprecedented proportions by the beginning of the 20th century. The U.S. produced more steel than Britain, Germany, and France combined, and Henry Ford's automobiles, created through the revolutionary assembly line system, became a symbol of industrial progress. These achievements not only ensured the development of the domestic market, but also promoted active participation in international trade. The U.S. railroad network became the largest in the world, linking inland regions with ports on the east and west coasts. This facilitated the transportation of agricultural goods, coal, oil, and steel, making the country's economy even more integrated. At the same time, cities were growing. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other megacities became centers of commerce, manufacturing, and finance, attracting millions of migrants from rural areas and immigrants from Europe. U.S. foreign policy also underwent a transformation. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, became a vivid representative of a new era of active diplomacy. His approach, known as Big Stick diplomacy, involved the use of military might to protect American interests. Roosevelt actively strengthened U.S. influence in Latin America by intervening in regional conflicts and supporting governments loyal to Washington. One of Roosevelt's most notable accomplishments was the construction of the Panama Canal. After Panama declared independence from Colombia with U.S. support, work began on a canal that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This engineering feat was completed in 1914, strengthening the U.S. strategic position in world trade and ensuring its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. In the Pacific, America was also actively expanding its influence. The annexation of Hawaii, control of the Philippines and Guam after the Spanish-American War, 1998, made the U.S. a key player in Asia-Pacific affairs. Roosevelt's diplomatic efforts, such as mediating the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, earned him the Nobel Peace Prize and established the U.S. role as an arbiter in international conflicts. Along with international successes, the country was experiencing rapid domestic change. By 1910, more than half of the U.S. population lived in cities. Urbanization was the result not only of industrial growth, but also of mass migration. Millions of people from rural areas moved to industrial centers such as Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, where new jobs were created. Immigrants from Europe, including Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, became a major source of labor. However, this rapid growth was accompanied by problems. Workers faced harsh working conditions, low wages, and a lack of social protection. There was overcrowding in large cities, and unsanitary conditions and high crime rates in poor neighborhoods. These problems gave rise to reform movements aimed at improving working and living conditions. Social contradictions developed in parallel with economic growth and urbanization. Industrialization deepened the gap between rich and poor. Monopoly corporations, such as John Rockefeller's Standard Oil, concentrated vast resources in the hands of a small group of people, causing discontent among the middle and working classes. Strikes and worker protests became commonplace, especially in industries such as coal mining and railroads. Against this background, the labor movement began to emerge. Organizations such as the American Federation of Labor, AFL, fought for shorter working hours, higher wages, and better working conditions. Although government support for the working class was limited in the early part of the century, the rise of the social movement forced politicians to pass the first laws regulating labor relations. In addition, during this period, the United States began to build a system of national parks. The environmental movement supported by Roosevelt led to the creation of conservation areas such as Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. This was an important step in preserving the country's natural heritage. The Progressive Era, 1901 to 1917, was a time of significant transformation in the social, economic, and political life of the United States. The Progressive movement embraced a diverse cross-section of society, from journalists and academics to politicians and activists, who sought to create a more just and stable country. Roosevelt epitomized progressive reform. His square deal policies included protecting the interests of the working class, controlling large corporations, and preserving natural resources. He was the first president to openly oppose monopolies, and his fight against trusts became a key aspect of domestic policy. Roosevelt initiated antitrust investigations against companies such as John Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Northern Securities Company, and succeeded in breaking them up. These actions not only reduced the influence of large corporations, but also strengthened the federal government's role in regulating the economy. Roosevelt's social reforms also affected working conditions. His administration actively supported laws restricting child labor, improved safety standards, and shortened the workday. Special attention was paid to protecting workers in hazardous industries such as coal mining and steel production. After the tragedy at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911, where a fire killed more than 140 people, mass protests began across the country demanding better working conditions. This led to the passage of new laws that strengthened workplace safety controls. Investigative journalists, dubbed "make trackers," have played an important role in shaping public opinion. Publications by authors such as Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, and Lincoln Steffens exposed corruption, unfair business practices, and appalling living conditions in poor neighborhoods. For example, Sinclair's novel The Jungle, which dealt with the meatpacking industry, shocked the public and spurred the passage of the Meat Inspection Act, 1906, and the Pure Food and Drug Act. These reforms laid the foundation for the modern system of sanitary control and standardization. The progressive movement promoted reforms at the level of the electoral system as well. In 1913, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, establishing direct election of senators, which increased the accountability of politicians. In addition, some states introduced mechanisms such as referendums and recall rights, which increased the influence of citizens in governing the country. An important element of the Progressive Era was the women's rights movement. From the mid-19th century, activists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony fought for women's suffrage. In the 1900s, movement grew stronger with the creation of organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA. Women held rallies, organized marches, and wrote petitions demanding equality. Their efforts were supported by progressive politicians and journalists. One of the movement's biggest victories was the expansion of voting rights in several western states such as Wyoming and Colorado. These successes laid the groundwork for the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, which secured the right to vote for women at the federal level. The Progressive Era also influenced the struggle for African American rights. Despite the abolition of slavery, Jim Crow laws introduced in the South legalized segregation and disenfranchised blacks from political rights. Leaders in the African American community offered a variety of approaches to combat discrimination. Booker T. Washington called for gradual reform through education and economic development, while W.E.B. Du Bois favored immediate political equality. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was founded, bringing together activists and becoming an important tool in the civil rights struggle. Financial reforms were also an important part of the Progressive Era. After a series of banking crises and panics in 1907, it became apparent that the country needed a more stable and centralized financial system. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, which created a national central bank. This system ensured regulation of the money supply and control of banking activities, which helped to reduce the risks of financial crises in the future. Conservation of natural resources became an important area of reform. With Theodore Roosevelt's support, many national parks and reserves were created, and conservation policy became part of the national agenda. It was a response to massive deforestation, land depletion, and river pollution. Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and other national parks have become symbols of concern for natural heritage. With the end of the Progressive Era in 1917, when the United States entered World War I, the country had already been significantly transformed. It was a period that demonstrated that reforms were possible even in the face of dramatic economic and social change. World War I, 1914 to 1918, was a turning point for the United States that changed its role on the international stage and had a more profound impact on domestic politics. During the first years of the war, the country remained neutral, reflecting isolationist sentiments in society. However, in 1917, the geopolitical situation changed, and a series of provocative actions on the part of Germany forced the United States to enter the conflict on the side of the Entente, which became a key factor in the victory of the Allies. For many Americans whose ancestors had recently emigrated from Europe, the decision was a symbol of unity in a multicultural country. In addition, American society, which had not yet forgotten the horrors of the Civil War, preferred to read participation in a new bloodshed. However, the U.S. did not go completely sideways. Its economy was linked to Britain and France. The U.S. exported food, raw materials, and arms to its allies. These shipments made serious profits in the American economy, and also angered Germany, which sought to interrupt trade through unrestricted submarine warfare. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. Congress supported Woodrow Wilson's appeal to declare war on Germany. The president stated that America must enter the conflict to make the world safe for democracy. This decision marked a new phase in the country's history, signaling its withdrawal from the budget and its willingness to play an active role in international affairs. Entry into the war required a massive mobilization of the resources of all countries. The government conducted a massive conscription aimed at increasing the army from 200,000 to more than 4 million men. The military budget increased dramatically. The economy was restructured to meet the needs of the war. Industrial enterprises were reoriented to the production of ammunition, weapons, ships, and airplanes. Financial bonds were introduced to finance the war, widely advertised as freedom bonds. Millions of Americans, including children, purchased them, thus contributing to the overall victory. Taxes on the income of corporations and wealthy individuals were increased, forcing the government to shut down a corresponding portion of spending. The role of women in wartime increased significantly. They worked in factories, in transportation, medical care, and in duties related to management and logistics. Their active participation in the economy and society strengthened the suffrage movement, which eventually led to the passage of the 19th Resolution in 1920. African Americans also made small contributions to the war effort. The Great Migration that began during these years resulted in hundreds of thousands of African Americans moving from the South to northern cities, where they took industrial jobs. In addition, some 400,000 Black Americans served in the military, albeit under segregated conditions. These experiences fostered self-awareness and strengthened their desire to fight for equal rights. American troops began arriving in Europe in June 1917. Their creation was small, but by the end of the war, the American Expeditionary Army, led by General John Pershing, had registered more than 2 million soldiers. Pershing's principled position was to maintain the autonomy of American troops, under which the U.S. participated in the war on an equal footing with the Allies, not as an auxiliary force. American soldiers, known as Dodo Boys, played a key role in the final months of the war. They participated in a number of decisive battles, such as the offensive at Saint-Omiel and the Meuse-Argonne operation, which greatly weakened the German army. These victories, enhanced by U.S. initiatives and achievements, were equivalent to the German surrender. On November 11, 1918, Germany supports an armistice, ending the war. Although U.S. involvement in the conflict was relatively significant, its impact was decisive. Military resources, financial support, and the presence of U.S. troops strengthened the Allies, who by 1917 were already on the verge of exhaustion. After the war, the United States took center stage in world negotiations. At the Paris World Conference in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson proposed his 14-point program, which envisioned the creation of a new world order. Among the main ideas were the rights of peoples to self-determination, open diplomacy, arms reduction, and the creation of the Money League, an international organization aimed at preventing future wars. Despite U.S. leadership in drafting the Treaty of Versailles, its provisions were controversial domestically. Many U.S. senators feared that joining the League would limit the country's sovereignty and draw it into unnecessary conflicts. The Senate refused to ratify the treaty, and the United States was left out of the League, reflecting a growing isolationist sentiment. After the war, the United States faced a number of challenges. The economy, which had thrived on war production, began to restructure the world market. Factories working on the front lines of need cut back on production, leading to temporary unemployment and growth. The return of millions of veterans to the labor market put additional pressure on the economic system. The social changes brought about by the war were also ahead of the curve. Women's role in the economy increased, which was a necessary step towards empowerment. African Americans in Britain and in government began to demand equal treatment, leading to a rising tide of self-consciousness. Although segregation and discrimination persisted, the war laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements that followed. The war also had an impact on U.S. political life. Isolationism, which had temporarily receded into the background, returned in the 1920s as a consociational trend. America avoided power in European affairs, focusing on domestic problems. This reflected public disillusionment with international politics, caused by unjustified losses and the complexity of the post-war settlement. World War I was a turning point for the United States. It consolidated its status as a world power, demonstrated its ability to adapt to global challenges, and made an important contribution to the Allied victory. However, the country remained bifurcated between isolationism and ambitions of global leadership, which will be a key theme of its foreign policy in the future. 1920s in the United States was a time of cultural and activist flourishing, which has gone down in history as the Jazz Age and the Roaring Twenties. This period was characterized by rapid economic growth, technological innovation, and a cultural revolution that changed the face of the country. After the end of World War II, American society experienced an upswing in sentiment. Victory in the war had strengthened the sense of national pride, and economic gain had given millions of people new opportunities. Industrialization and mass production of goods such as automobiles and appliances, affordable to the middle class. Henry Ford has become not only a symbol of progress, but also a part of everyday life for millions of Americans. Jazz was one of the most colorful cultural phenomena of the era. Born in the African American communities of New Orleans, this genre gained popularity in all walks of life. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and other jazz stars became true icons of the time. Jazz clubs, such as the famous Cotton Club in Harlem, attract people from different social groups and create an atmosphere of freedom and creativity. The literature and art of the 1920s was also in its heyday. American literature of this time gave the world such writers as Francis Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and William Faulkner. Fitzgerald, in his famous novel The Great Gatsby, depicted the luxury and inner emptiness of the Roaring Twenties, criticizing the pursuit of wealth as the highest value. The writers of the Lost Generation, many of whom had lived through the horrors of World War, searched for meaning in an era when moral foundations seemed shattered. Hollywood at this time became the center of world film production. The current cinema has experienced a golden age, and actors like Charlie Chaplin have become international stars. American society also became increasingly urbanized. By 1920, more than half the country's population lived in cities, and metropolitan areas such as New York and Chicago became centers of cultural life. Skyscrapers, such as the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, have become symbols of modernity and technological advancement. At the same time, the Roaring Twenties was an era of contradiction. Prohibition, passed in 1920, prohibited the production and sale of alcohol. But instead of reducing its consumption, it spawned a boom in underground bars and organized crime. Figures such as Al Capone became symbols of the shadow side of the era. The era of the Roaring Twenties was also a time of bitter struggles for social equality. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities that began during World War II continued, giving rise to black communities in places like Harlem in New York City. The Harlem Renaissance became representative of a major cultural era. Writers such as Langston Hughes, musicians such as Bessie Smith, and artists such as Aaron Douglas created works that celebrated African American culture and challenged racial stereotypes. Racial conflict, however, was an acute problem. The Jim Crow system continued in southern states, and the growing popularity of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s exacerbated tensions. Despite this, African American activists, such as NAACP leader James Weldon, continued to fight for civil rights. The economy continued to flourish amidst cultural and activist prosperity. The standard of living of the middle class rose and a new consumer culture swept across the country. Radio became the most important enterprise of information and entertainment, uniting society and shaping mass culture. Advertising stimulated sales of new products, from automobiles to household appliances. Nevertheless, during this time, the gloss masked problems. The growth of the economy was based on consumer credit, stock speculation, and an over-reliance on new technologies. These factors laid the groundwork for the financial crisis that erupted at the end of the swing. The Roaring Twenties was a period in U.S. history when the country experienced simultaneous flourishes and crises. Cultural achievements such as jazz, literature, and film laid the foundation for modern American culture, while social changes paved the way for future reform. However, this period ended with a sharp shock, the stock market crash of 1929, which ushered in the Great Depression. The Great Depression was one of the largest economic crises in U.S. history. Beginning with the stock market crash of October 1929, it realized all aspects of American life, from economic to social, and changed the role of the state in governing the country. 1920s masterpieces like the Roaring Twenties, a rich illusion of prosperity. The growth of the consumer economy, mass production, and stock speculation created an appearance of stability. However, the economic foundation was based on a fragile foundation. Unequal income distribution, increased reliance on credit, and high levels of debt. The stock market crash, which began on October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, caused a chain reaction. Millions of Americans lost their savings, thousands of banks went bankrupt, and companies closed en masse. The unemployment rate has reached 25%, indicating that 1 in 4 Americans are out of work. The crisis among farmers was particularly severe. Overproduction of agricultural products in the 1920s led to falling prices, and in the 1930s, a drought known as the Dust Bowl hit the Great Terms. This forced thousands of farming families to leave their land in search of work and a better life. Against the backdrop of the economic situation in the crash, social problems escalated, including an increase in crime associated with the Prohibition Law. Passed in 1920, this law prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol, which was supposed to be in the framework of strengthening society. However, it was replaced by a flourishing underground liquor trade and organized crime. Major cities such as Chicago and New York became epicenters of illegal alcohol trafficking. One of the most famous figures of this era was Al Capone, whose criminal empire made millions of dollars from the sale of alcohol. The Chicago gangster controlled a network of underground bars, speakeasies, corrupted police and officials, and used conservative violent methods. His name became a symbol of Prohibition-era organized crime. Along with the rise in crime, Prohibition capitalized on public discontent. In 1933, after much debate, it was repealed by the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. This ended one of the most controversial periods in American politics, but its effects, including the enforcement of organized crime, were felt for a long time to come. As the crisis continued to worsen, President Herbert Hoover's measures proved limited. Hoover declared that the economy should recover in a preserved manner and avoided a direct state presidency. His approach sparked intense resentment. Makeshift homeless camps sprang up, which became known across the country as Hooverites. State discontent peaked in 1932 when World War I veterans built the Bonus Army March. Thousands of profiteers in Washington, D.C. demanded immediate payment of promised bonuses. However, the protest was suppressed with the use of the army, sparking public outrage and dealing a serious blow to Hoover's reputation. Against the backdrop of these events, Franklin D. Roosevelt won a landslide victory in the 1932 presidential election. His New Deal program was aimed at active government intervention in international conflicts and dealing with the consequences of the crisis. Roosevelt began his presidency with a reform that changed the role of the federal government in governing the country. One of Roosevelt's first measures was to stabilize the banking system. In the early days of his presidency, he declared bank vacations, temporarily closing all banks to test their financial solvency. This measure reduced public confidence, and the subsequent establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, led to the protection of citizens' savings. Roosevelt focused on job creation through large infrastructure projects. Programs such as the Public Works Administration, PWA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, accounted for millions of businesses. These projects not only reduce unemployment, but also limit the nation's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, schools, and poverty parks. These measures helped stabilize the market and enabled many farmers to avoid bankruptcy. Additionally, large-scale projects were launched to irrigate lands and regions with soil erosion, especially in the regions affected by the dust cauldron. One of the most significant achievements of the New Deal was the creation of a social safety net. In 1935, the Social Security Act was passed, which provided pensions for the privileged, benefits for the unemployed, and support for needy families. This reform was a major milestone in U.S. history, laying the foundation for today's rigid welfare system. Roosevelt placed great emphasis on protecting labor rights. The Wagner Act of 1935 gave the following rights to collective international rights and unionization. This strengthened labor's position and led to the growth of the labor movement. Organizations such as the Congress of Industrial Unions, CIO, began to take action to improve working conditions and raise wages. Despite its successes, the New Deal met resistance. Conservatives faulted Roosevelt for destroying the foundations of the free market, and the Supreme Court struck down a number of key programs that forced the president to reconsider his initiatives. By the mid-1930s, however, the New Deal had already begun to bear fruit, showing the first signs of economic destruction. By the end of the 1930s, the Great Depression continued to plague political society. Despite successes in a number of New Deal reforms, many of the economy's structural problems remained unresolved. The second wave crisis of 1937 to 1938 culminated in the vulnerability of the recovery process. Although unemployment fell from a peak of 25% to 14%, millions of Americans were still unemployed, and farmers continued to suffer from low prices for produce and support. Meanwhile, the New Deal brought about the need for long-term changes. The state began to intervene more actively in the economic life of the country, which was not the case in the Great Depression. The social safety net created under Roosevelt's program was a major achievement. The Social Security Act of 1935 laid the foundation for a pension system and unemployment insurance, which gave Americans more confidence in the future. The rise of labor unions was also an indicator of the industrial age. The Wagner Act gave workers association and collective bargaining rights, which greatly limited working conditions and strengthened the position of the working classes. Organizations such as the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and the Congress of Industrial Unions, CIO, became the basis for policy and recommendations. The social and cultural consequences of the Great Depression were no less significant. The crisis changed the worldview of Americans, reinforcing a society of solidarity and collective responsibility. People began to value social institutions and cooperative efforts to adapt more. The culture of the 1930s took on a new emphasis. The Great Depression inspired artists, writers, and musicians to create that reflected the realities of the times. The Federal Art Project funded support for thousands of artists who created murals, posters, books, and other works that told the lives of ordinary Americans. Music, especially folk and blues, became a means of expressing the feelings and hope of the people. Artists such as Woody Guthrie create songs that show poverty, injustice, and the desire for a better life. Movies also have the ingredients of unification of public associations. In addition to light comedies and musicals, Hollywood showed a number of films reflecting harsh realities. Documentaries and dramas not only raised pressing social issues, but also helped build public sentiment in favor of reform. A key provision for recovery from the Great Depression was World War II. Although the economy began a slow recovery in the late 1930s, it was not until the country's financial mobilization in the 1940s that a full recovery was achieved. Industrial production, focused on supplies for the Allies and its own armed forces, grew dramatically, creating millions of jobs. The U.S. entry into World War II in 1941 dramatically changed the economic picture. The production of tanks, planes, guns, and ammunition increased the demand for labor. Women who had previously worked in New Deal community projects began to occupy key positions in war factories, which enhanced their social status and spurred the movement for gender equality. Farmers also benefited from war production. Agricultural prices rose, and the state bought huge amounts of food for the army. This helped many farms get out of the crisis. By 1942, the unemployment rate had fallen to nearly zero. The Great Depression was officially over, but its lessons remained an important part of the national memory. They shaped the foundations for post-war prosperity and reinforced the belief in the need for active government involvement in the economy. World War II was a turning point in the history of the United States. Until 1941, the country tried to remain neutral, adhering to an isolationist policy after the experience of the First World War. However, despite the official position, the United States supported the Allies through the Lend-Lease program to provide arms, equipment, and food to Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. The situation changed dramatically on the morning of December 7, 1941, when Japan suddenly attacked the American naval bases at Pearl Harbor. The attack destroyed 8 battleships, 144 aircraft, and resulted in over 2,400 casualties. That day, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt, remains in history as a day of infamy. The attack was a decisive moment for U.S. aid in World War II. Congress almost unanimously declared war on Japan, and soon Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. With the outbreak of war, the United States became a key player on the world stage. The American economy, which had recently suffered from the Great Depression, was completely restructured to meet the needs of war production. Factories produced tanks, airplanes, ships, and weapons in record numbers. The women who took factory jobs became a symbol, Rosie the Riveter, epitomizing each citizen's contribution to victory. On the Pacific Front, the United States faced a significant adversary in the form of Japan. One of the first major successes was the Battle of Midway in 1942, when the U.S. fleet destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, marking a turning point in the war in the Pacific. The following years were marked by the island hopping strategy, where Army troops successively captured key islands such as Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. This victory paved the way for a direct invasion of Japan. On the European front, the U.S. became active from 1942, joining the Allied efforts in the north. Operation Torch culminated in the success of the liberation of North Africa from German forces. This was followed by landings in Sicily and Italy, which led to the fall of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. However, the most significant U.S. contribution to the liberation of Europe was Operation Overlord, known as the Normandy landings, which began June 6, 1944. On D-Day, tens of thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers landed on the Normandy coast. This day was the beginning of the largest retreat of Nazi forces on the Western Front. After the successful landing, the Allies began to liberate France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, pushing deep into Germany. American troops played a key role in the Battle of the Ardennes in the winter of 1944 to 1945, which was the largest counterattack by the German army. By May 1945, Germany was finally defeated, and army troops joined the Allies in Berlin. Hitler committed suicide and the Third Reich capitulated. Victory in Europe was greeted with jubilation, but the war in the Pacific continued. The US was ready for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese islands, which promised huge casualties on the other side. However, the decision was made to use a new weapon, the atomic bomb developed as part of the Manhattan Project. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, on Nagasaki. These events led to Japan's surrender September 2, 1945, ending the war. World War II changed the United States. The victory solidified their status as the world's leading power. The American economy, boosted by war production, became one of the most powerful in the world. U.S. military bases sprang up all over the globe, and the country assumed responsibility for maintaining international security. In the international arena, the United States initiated the creation of a new system of global order. In 1945, the United Nations organization was founded with the aim of preventing future wars. American diplomacy played a leading role in shaping the structure of the UN and in drafting its charter. However, victory brought opportunities as well as challenges. The alliance with the Soviet Union, which had helped defeat Nazism, quickly turned into a global confrontation. The United States and the Soviet Union had different ideological views on the future of the world, which became a good support for the Cold War. The outcome of World War II led to a new role of the United States in the world. The country, which until 1941 had sought to observe neutrality on the scale of conflicts, has become a central player in global politics. Its economic power, military resources, and influence in the international arena have set new standards of leadership that keep the world in a strong position. With the end of World War II in 1945, the world became divided into two ideological camps: the capitalist camp, led by the United States, and the communist camp, led by the Soviet Union. This confrontation became known as the Cold War, and although there was no direct fighting between the two superpowers, their struggle for global influence played a major role in world politics for several decades. The Cold War began with the escalation of relations between former allies. The Soviet Union took control of modern Eastern Europe, turning them into communist satellites. In response, President Harry Truman in 1947 proclaimed a doctrine that has gone down in history as the Truman Doctrine. Its goal was to contain the spread of communism by providing economic and military aid to countries threatened by the Soviets. One of the first initiatives under this doctrine was the Marshall Plan, an economic aid program to rebuild the war-torn economies of Europe. The U.S. allocated billions of dollars to rebuild the economies of countries such as France, Britain, Germany, and Italy to prevent the rise of communist sentiment in those countries. In 1949, the United States initiated the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance that was supposed to protect Western countries from possible aggression by the USSR. In response, the Soviet Union approved the Warsaw Pact, under which the Eastern Bloc countries joined the military alliance. The first major conflict of the Cold War was the Korean War. In 1950, the Communist North, allied with the USSR and China, invaded South Korea. The U.S., developing its liberation strategy, intervened in the conflict under the auspices of the UN. The war lasted 3 years and ended with an armistice in 1953. The borders between North Korea and South Korea have remained largely unchanged, but the conflicting political power of the United States uses military force to prevent the spread of communism. In the 1950s, the Cold War entered a phase of active rivalry. One of the main characteristics of this period is the arms race. Both sides sought to build up their nuclear arsenals. After the United States successfully tested the first hydrogen bomb in 1952, the Soviet Union soon developed its own weapon. The Union began a space race that came to symbolize the scientific and technological rivalry between the two powers. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957 came as a shock to the United States. In response, they accelerated their space program, which eventually led to the creation of NASA in 1958 and began preparations for the moon landing. Tensions peaked during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. After the USSR deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, the US declared a naval blockade of the island and demanded their immediate destruction. Efforts made, including secret US concessions to remove its missile from Turkey, have resolved the crisis but have demonstrated the fragility of global security. The Cold War emerged through proxy wars, conflicts in which the US and USSR supported opposite sides. One of the largest was the Vietnam conflict. The US intervened in the war on the side of South Vietnam in an attempt to prevent it from being taken over by communists from North Vietnam. By 1965, the US had deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, but the war proved protracted and unpopular. Protests against the Vietnam War gripped the US, especially among young people. The war ended in 1975 with the US defeat, a serious blow to its influential prestige. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and the United States continued to strengthen their positions in other regions of the world. The USSR actively supported revolutionary movements in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, while the US sought to prevent the spread of communism through economic aid and military intervention. By the end of the 1970s, the Cold War continued to be at the center of world politics. The confrontation between the US and the USSR shaped the international order, which determined the political, military, and economic strategy of the outside world. However, the 1980s were ahead, when the Cold War reached its climax and began to draw to a close. Subsequent eras in the United States were significant social changes that shaped a new social consciousness. In the 1950s to 1970s, the United States was experiencing a tumultuous period of human rights, race, and genetic relations and cultural development. Protest movements, cultural transformations, and civil rights struggles were a starting part of this era. One of the most significant events of this period was the struggle for civil rights for African Americans. Despite victory in the Civil War and the legal abolition of slavery, racial segregation persisted in the southern United States, and African Americans continued to face discrimination. In the 1950s and 1960s, this led to a powerful civil rights movement led by figures such as Martin Luther King, Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. One of the most iconic moments was the 1955 bus boycott in Montgomery, when Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger, which started a massive struggle. Inspired by this event, Martin Luther King led the movement by promoting non-mainstream violent methods of protest and struggle for rights. In 1963, his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington became a symbol of the quest for equality and social justice. In addition, the 1960s and 1970s were times of important struggles for women's rights. Women in the U.S. began to actively fight for their rights to work, education, and political participation. A major step in this direction was the passage of the Equal Opportunity Act in 1963, which prohibited sex discrimination in the workplace. These years also saw the rise of the feminist movement, which argued for change in social and political societies. An important moment was the beginning of the struggle for women's rights to abortion, which led to the 1973 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, which legalized women's right to choose pregnancy. At the same time, young people began to actively participate in protest movements, protesting the Vietnam War and social injustice. The student protests of the 1960s became the basis of political culture. In response to the arms race and U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, university students across the country took to the streets nationwide to demand world and social justice. These protests reached a climax in 1968 when the Democratic Party in Chicago came between police and demonstrators. Cultural change was also part of social transformation. The 1960s was an occasion to show the counterculture, which rejected conservative norms and values. It was a period of showing the hippie movement, which promoted peace, love, and freedom. Music, especially rock and roll and folk music, played a crucial role in the entire protest and cultural identity of the time. Legends such as Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and others expressed their feelings through their songs of protest against war and racism, as well as against political pressures. In addition, the television revolution has significantly changed public perception. New shows and movies began to portray societal issues such as racism, poverty, and war more openly. In the 1970s, television also played a key role in popularizing women's and minority rights, demonstrating changes in society and providing a platform for new voices. The 1980s was the time when the Cold War came to its climax and conclusion. The U.S., under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan, took an active stance in confronting the Soviet Union, using both political pressure and strong leverage. This eventually led to the weakening of the USSR and its collapse in 1991, cementing the status of the U.S. as the benchmark global superpower. With the advent of Reagan in 1981, America's policy toward the Soviet Union took a tougher turn. Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire and increased financial spending in an effort to increase pressure on the Soviet threat. One of the major initiatives was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, known as Star Wars, which envisioned a missile defense system using space technology. Although this program was never implemented, it forced the USSR to significantly increase defense spending, contributing to the country's economic crisis. In the international arena, the U.S. continued to maintain communist influence by actively supporting anti-regime movements around the world. In Afghanistan, the United States supported the Mujahideen fighting against Soviet troops, which was one of the revolutionary factors in wearing down the USSR in that conflict. In Latin America, the United States supported anti-communist forces such as the Contras in Nicaragua. A key moment in the end of the Cold War was the election of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev initiated sweeping reforms such as glasnost and perestroika that were aimed at modernizing the economy of society and the USSR. These reforms, while well-intentioned, led to increased internal globalization and growing discontent in the East Kazakhstan bloc. In 1989, a wave of revolutions began in the Soviet-controlled countries of Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other countries overthrew the communist regimes that had come to symbolize the Soviet system of the crash. The fall of the Berlin Wall in the Rock in 1989 was one of the major symbols of the end of the Cold War era. This event not only colonized Germany, but also demonstrated the power of people's aspirations for freedom. The U.S. observing events stepped up efforts to accelerate the democratization process. President George H.W. Bush, who succeeded Reagan in 1989, continued his policy of supporting reform in Eastern Europe and in the USSR itself. By 1991, the Soviet Union was on the verge of imprisonment. Gorbachev's reforms failed to keep the country from disintegrating. After an attempted security coup in August 1991, Gorbachev's power weakened, and on December 25, 1991, he officially announced the dissolution of the USSR. The US and its allies proclaimed the end of the Cold War, and the American model of democracy and market economy became developed in the world. The end of the Cold War marked a coming turning point in the history of the United States. America remained the recognized world superpower, consolidating its leadership in the economic, and military world. This period marked the beginning of a new era in which the United States took a leading role in the world order. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, the United States entered a new period as the leader of the world superpower. The end of the rivalry with the Soviet Union opened the door for the country to focus on a global system in which the United States became the leading player. However, the new world was no less complex than the previous one. and America faced many challenges, including globalization, economics, crises, and climate change. The 1990s were a time when the U.S. consolidated its global influence. After the rise of the Soviet Union, the country focused on promoting democracy and the free market, especially in Eastern Europe. NATO's expansion, which began in 1999, included countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in the alliance, cementing U.S. influence in directions. At the same time, the U.S. economy experienced a technological boom due to the development of the Internet and the IT sector, making the U.S. the center of global innovation. However, U.S. world domination has not been serene. In 2001, the terrorist attacks of September 11th became a turning point in the country's history. The attacks, which claimed the lives of nearly 3,000 people, shocked Americans and became a major revision of domestic and foreign policy. In response to the appeal, the U.S. declared war on terrorism, launching military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was aimed at overthrowing the Taliban regime that was harboring al-Qaeda leaders. In 2003, the United States launched a war in Iraq under the pretext of destroying weapons of mass destruction, which became one of the most controversial decisions of American foreign policy. The crises of the 2000s were not limited to wars. In 2008, the global financial crisis caused by the collapse of the mortgage market was a shock to the world economy since the Great Depression. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, and the 2010s saw an increase in social and political change. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 was historic. He became the nation's first African-American president. His administration focused on healthcare reform, called Obamacare, in response to climate change and post-recession economic recovery. However, the increasing political polarization in the country led to growing tensions between different states and international agreement. U.S. foreign policy has also undergone changes. The Obama administration proclaimed a reset of relations with the country, which, however, proved short-lived. At the same time, the U.S. focused on strengthening relations with China and other Asian countries as part of its Pivot to Asia strategy. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 marked a new phase in American politics. His administration focused on the slogan, "America First," paying attention to the country's national interests. This has come in the wake of the U.S. Paris Climate Accord, the tearing up of international agreements, and a tougher tariff war with China. Trump has also faced accusations of undermining democratic norms and manipulating political institutions, leading to his impeachment in 2019. The 2020s problems with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has become one of the most serious crises for the country. The U.S., like the rest of the world, faced the economic impact and consequences of the pandemic, including increased unemployment, business closures, and political disagreement over control measures. Despite the difficulties, the U.S. became a leader in developing and distributing a vaccine against COVID-19, which helped accelerate the recovery from the crisis. Against the backdrop of the pandemic, the struggle for racial and social equality has intensified. The assassination of George Floyd in 2020 sparked a wave of protests across the country and beyond. The Black Lives Matter movement came to symbolize the struggle for black rights and brought attention to issues of systemic racism. Joe Biden's election in 2020 marked a return to a more traditional U.S. foreign policy path. His administration has focused on rebuilding alliances for climate change and addressing social problems at home. However, challenges have been left behind, including confrontations with China and Russia, tensions with the economy, and division within British society. Modern America remains a leader in technology, innovation, and culture. Silicon Valley continues to be the center of global IT discoveries such as artificial intelligence and renewable energy. However, with the growing role of China and other powers, the U.S. faces the need to adapt to a multipolar world where its position is not unquestioned. The United States has traveled an incredible journey from small colonies striving for independence to a superpower influencing world politics, instability, and culture. The history of this country is a series of trials, upheavals, and achievements that have shaped it as a nation that symbolizes freedom, innovation, and a spirit of strength. Every phase of this history, from the struggle for independence and overcoming the Civil War, to winning a world war and leading the Cold War, has been a lesson for modern America. Globalization, advances in technology, social change, and confronting the challenges of the 21st century show how the past continues to influence the present. U.S. history offers important lessons: the value of democracy, the need to adapt to change, and managing national unity in the face of challenges. These lessons are relevant not only to Americans, but also to the world as it watches one of the most influential nations grapple with the challenges of our time. What does the future hold for the United States? The country faces new challenges, such as a multipolar world, climate change, the development of artificial intelligence, and serious competition with other powers. However, history shows that America can adapt to change and learn from crises. Its ability to balance internal contradictions and constant challenges. The coming results will determine its role in the New World Order, where the leader is the one who leads his world toward innovation, stability, and prosperity.